Episode of the Atlas Society Asks. I'm Richard Salsman. I'm one of the senior scholars at the Atlas Society. We're one of the leading nonprofit organizations that try to introduce young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in various creative ways, such as through animated videos and graphic novels. I am really pleased today to have as our guests Dr. Steve Hanke, but at Johns Hopkins University. I've known for many, many years. He's an absolute expert in many things, but among them monetary issues. He's affiliated with the Cato Institute. He's been with Johns Hopkins for a long time. By the way, I want to remind those of you who are joining us, you can also join on not just Zoom, but Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube. And feel free also to use the comment section to get in as many questions as you can. So we'll be looking at those, but I'll have my own. So formally, I just want to say Professor Hanke is a professor of applied economics, and he's founder and co-director of the Institute of Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise at Johns Hopkins University, and director of the Troubled Currencies Project at Cato, and a senior fellow at Cato's Center for the Study of Alternative Monetary Systems. Welcome, Professor Hanke. It's great to see you, and thank you for taking the time.
Well, Richard, great to be with you. Good to see you again.
I want to start with the thing I've noticed over the years, your success in not just in business, in trading commodities and currencies, but certainly as a professor. But I've always been intrigued by your title of having an interest and a specialty in applied economics. So my first question actually is economics itself, the profession now looking broad, do you think it's too abstract, too detached from reality, maybe overly rigorous in the sense of overly mathematical, whereas is it true that what you're doing, applied economics, is you're trying to find some practical applications for this, and therefore your students tend to make it in the real world in ways that other students might not? Am I making too much of that, or is that an important part of what you're doing?
No, Richard, that is an important part of what I'm doing. Let me start by answering that question with a little, let's say, autobiographical background on me. I grew up, I'm a country boy from the state of Iowa. For your viewers, that's where the tall corn grows. And so as a result of that, I observed things at a very young age, markets and so forth, because of course, like everybody else in Iowa, my family, my grandparents, are all were in agriculture, one sort or another. So I was going to the markets in Chicago and Omaha, and when I was 10 years old, I actually was assisting one of my grandfathers in hedging eggs. He had a big egg candling operation.
No kidding.
They would collect eggs, sort eggs, store eggs, and eventually, when they would get a big semi full of eggs, they'd send them back to New York or Boston. Well, that there was price risk associated with that. You put these things in storage, it could be a month between the time of collection and the time of delivery. So the price could be all over the place. So in those days, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange had a futures contract in eggs. And if you didn't want to take the price risk, you'd sell them forward on the futures market. Wow. So I did that. I was doing that when I was 10 years of age. And when I was 14, I opened my first trading account. And the first trades I put on, I was trading soybeans. So I understood a lot about markets when I was very, very, very young. And I also understood that if you're running a farm, or you got a lot of machinery, a lot of moving parts, and you better know how the thing fit together, and you also better know how to fix things if they were breaking down on you.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'd have big trouble. So that in fact, on reflection now, as shall we say, an older individual, yeah, I have reflected on this, and my applied economics comes from that seed, shall we say, and background. And when I was a graduate student, I actually did take a field. We had to take 5 fields for a PhD, and one of my fields was agricultural economics and natural resource economics. So that's a little background now. What did I do my dissertation in? In those days, I finished up my graduate work in 1969, and there was a huge debate going on in the 60s about whether the efficacy of installing water meters and charging for water on a per gallon or per cubic meter basis, or whether to just leave the usage unmetered and charge on a monthly basis with no marginal price.
Yeah.
So the engineers took the position that, if you put a per gallon price on things, it wouldn't make any difference anyway. So as a result, the meters would be just a waste of money.
Yeah.
And you'd have to read the meter, that cost money. And then things weren't digitized or anything. You have a meter man go around with a book taking records. So
I remember the meter.
I did the first econometric work on the effect of the installation of meters, and I did that in Boulder, Colorado, which I was a student at the University of Colorado, and we had all the primary data. All those meter books, we had them, and none of them were digitized. Of course, I had to go down and read the darn things. It took forever to take care of this, but at any rate, what did I do? Well, it was an applied problem. And it turned out, normalizing for everything, climate, soil conditions, it was a very complicated study. I showed that there was an enormous impact on water usage associated with charging a positive price per gallon.
Yeah.
That changed the whole picture in the United States. And of course, they started, once you did a benefit cost analysis of metering, it showed up, they had very high elasticities, especially in the western dry parts of the United States. In the summer, if you put a positive price on, people really cut back and they don't want to irrigate a yard so much. So they put sand in various parts, trees, you name it, and a lot of substitution effects take place. So at any rate, that was applied, but it was applied in more ways than one. That dissertation was in the economics department. I received my PhD in economics.
Yeah.
But it was published in the civil engineering department.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah.
Now why was this? It was because the demand for water, if you can accurately predict the effect and elasticities for price changes, that has a big influence on the design of the water system that you have.
Yeah.
Then the next step I took was literally to come to Johns Hopkins University. Well, I shouldn't say that. While I was finishing my PhD degree, I was fortunate enough to get a full-time position at the Colorado School of Mines, which is the most famous engineering school in the world, and it is an engineering school.
Yeah.
So I was teaching principles of economics to engineers.
Wow.
Then I came to Johns Hopkins in 1969.
Yeah.
And where did I come? I ended up in an engineering department because they wanted an economist who could do applied work and systems analysis.
Yeah.
So what was I doing? I continued with this water demand type work, but also I was doing all kinds of things like, this classical problem you get in principles of economics, economies of scale, and they have you look at the diameter of a pipe. I was actually designing and coming up with optimal design criteria for sewer interceptors. Those are the big pipes that take the crud away from the houses and industrial locations. So the Hanke design criteria for sewer interceptors is still used in Europe, by the way.
Wow.
So I started doing very applied, but at the interface of engineering and systems analysis. And this was micro at the highest degree of microeconomics.
Yeah.
And then since then, of course, I've evolved. And as you say, I'm doing monetary economics and international finance and other things. But I started doing very, very micro. So that's the background. You mentioned my students. My students are trained in what they call Hanke's atelier at Johns Hopkins.
Uh-huh.
And I take them through, they start as apprentices. By the time some of them are with me for 2 or 3 years, they become really journeymen. And some of them might even become masters eventually of the trade. So it's very much like an apprentice,
right,
journeyman, masters, and that's the way I train them. And the big model that we use that I've developed, and actually I'm just finishing a book on it right now. It is very applied. It's in valuation of trade on organized stock exchanges. So that involves a detailed discounted cash flow model with a lot of accounting. And as I mentioned to you before we came on, Richard, one of my professors was Kenneth Boulding, of course, famous economist that everyone should know. But Boulding's position always was, to be good in economics, you've got to be good in accounting. It's all about accounting. And Boulding is right. And so the discounted cash flow model is my tweak on discounted cash flow. Okay, we have that. But the unique part of it is we couple that discounted cash flow model up with a Monte Carlo simulation. And when you do that, it allows you to actually predict whether a stock price is going to go up or go down.
Uh-huh.
So that's and the students, by the way, it's a very selective program, but the students all get their top jobs on Wall Street.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, I'm aware. That is quite a story. You remember the controversy, Dr. Hanke, in the 1970s about the micro foundations of macro. The feeling was the macro people were going off the rails because they didn't really know underlying microeconomic principles. And, you're reminding me of the real value associated with that, not just the accounting aspects, but microeconomics, price theory, industry stuff. I myself, MBA, I trained first in MBAs. Yeah, so the whole idea of T accounts and accounting and cash flows really grounded in a way that that macro doesn't. I have to ask you a question, because when you say 1969 to me, I'm thinking you look out in the world in 1969 and think to yourself, am I going to go into like currency stuff? They were all fixed until 71, right? And after 71, I'm curious to ask you this. After 71, they go off the gold standard. Not only do we have now floating exchange rates and FX currency crosses to predict and worry about, but also the gold price is all over the place and the oil price is all over the place. I'm curious whether that phenomenon of going off the gold standard in 71 turned your attentions to, well, I wonder if I can use my skills to predict commodity futures, options. That whole thing exploded in the 70s because we got off the gold standard. Did that have an influence on your shift over to financial commodity?
Not exactly, but there's kind of this. I was into commodities at age 10, so
right.
So that and age 10 was, Richard, that was quite a few years before 1969 or 1971.
Right.
But there's an interesting story here, and that is, I kind of moved away from that as a personally, but in 1985, I'd written an article in Barron's magazine, and I got a call from Dr. Albert Friedberg in Toronto, and Dr. Albert Friedberg happens to be a big Austrian economist, but he also was a extremely successful trader had the biggest trading house and still does. I'm happen to be chairman emeritus of the Friedberg Mercantile Group. But in 1985, Friedberg had done very well anticipating what would happen to gold after 1971, 73. So he was flying high into commodities and into currencies. And he called me after the Barron's article and he said, would you like to come up and let's have lunch in Toronto? And, I'd like to see what you're thinking about, because the article was very Austrian. And so we had lunch and immediately came to terms. He said, would you like to join the firm? And I said, I think that'd be great. I'd love to. So I did. I, of course, stayed at Hopkins, but I became the chief economist at Friedberg Mercantile Group.
I remember.
And the first thing that I did was I had a fairly plain vanilla model for OPEC.
Yeah.
This is 1985.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic. Friedberg had been on this case anyway. I modeled it out. We came to the conclusion that OPEC was going to collapse, which it did. And we also predicted, using a simple model, simple elasticities and so forth, that the oil price would plunge below $10 a barrel, which it did.
Which it did in the
we ended up, we were young, a lot less risk control in this day and age. And we had huge short positions in oil, not only crude oil, but gas oil, and we were short the Saudi rial and the Kuwaiti dinar. The OPEC collapsed in 1986. We were right. All our ships came in. It was a fantastic thing. And looking back to show you how big we were, we had 70% of all the short interest in the gas oil contract in London.
Wow.
So that was the first big trade I was associated with. And then, of course, a lot of currencies and so forth. There were currencies involved in that package. The Kuwaiti dinar was fixed to the US dollar, and so was the Saudi rial, and they both devalued. So
everyone at the time assumed OPEC was monolithic. They just arbitrarily and capriciously determined the oil price. I remember dickering with the gold oil price ratio, kind of using it as a P ratio. There are ways to predict this without just assuming that monolithic control, right? But that was the standard view in the 70s.
Absolutely. So at any rate, all those markets opened up, and it turned out Friedberg is an Austrian economist.
Yeah.
So our thinking was the same, and in addition, of course, he really taught me the tricks of the trade, because he really was he was and is a cutting edge trader, and I mean, he trades virtually anything that moves.
That's funny. Now let me ask you about Austria. You mentioned Austrian. Where did you pick it up? When did you first learn about it? But specifically, I'm interested in, how the Austrians often emphasize, nothing can really be quantified and nothing is really predictable. I'm intrigued by the idea that you're at once Austrian, or at least neo-Austrian, but also you feel like, no, things can be, it sounds like you're saying things can be quantified, you can predict, you can use some math. Is there a conflict there, or is this applied Austrian economics, really?
Well, I would say it's applied Austrian. The Austrians get themselves all worked up about various shall we say subgroups within the within the temple, and et cetera, et cetera. That kind of stuff just doesn't interest me at all.
Yeah.
I see a problem, and my whole life, whether I was a farm kid, the tractor breaks down. How in the world are you going to fix the thing and get it running again?
Right.
So you see a market and take a look at it. Even today, in anticipation of our discussion today, what was I doing? I was spending a lot of time looking at various commodity markets in some detail. I mean, I spent literally the whole morning looking at things like lithium, silicon, graphite, all of these markets, and which have gone up tremendously, by the way, in value in the last 12 months. There's been a huge surge, and silicon has just gone through the roof.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at any rate, these things are active, and what are you going to do if you're an Austrian? You're not going to look at the price of silicon and ask yourself,
yeah,
this has something to do with supply and demand. This has something to do with expectations.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's just silly not to. If you're looking at markets, you have to look at numbers. You have to look at supply. You have to look at demand. You have to look at expectations. This is what makes the world go around, Richard.
Agreed. And the use I made of Austrian, I was introduced to it just as a pro-capitalist argument. But then when I got into the forecasting business, that's how you met. I was working with the people at Wainwright up in Boston. What interested me really was the interest rate theory. I'm thinking, well, interest rates, that is something that affects the structure of production. That is something that captures what business people are doing in calculations, unlike the monetarists who were telling us that M3 or M2 was relevant. No, I thought the Austrian view of the business cycle, the idea of the manipulation of interest rates, now that's something we could use, or the shape of the yield curve. When Ranson and I were working on the shape of the yield curve as a forecaster, that to me is much more applied Austrian. And now you're talking bottom line stuff. Now you're talking not just theory in the air, but actual applications. Now, didn't you work in the Reagan White House? How did you get the Reagan job? You were in the Council of Economic Advisors for a couple of years in the early 80s, right? How did that come about, and what'd you think of it? What did you think of tour of duty, so to speak?
It came about with precision because someone who I collaborated with for a long time, William A. Niskanen, Bill Niskanen.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Bill, I advised him. He was the head honcho at the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget in Washington.
Yeah.
And I advised him in particular about water resource projects and benefit cost evaluation of these water resource projects. Then Bill went off to Ford Motor Company and became chief economist. And until he got canned, as you recall, because he was advocating free trade in automobiles.
Yeah, right. I remember that. Oh, right. Is that when he went? Is that when he went to Cato? You went to Cato.
No. He went to the University of California, and then he invited me to join him at the University of California at Berkeley, which I did.
Wow.
And then he came back to serve as a member of Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, and he asked me to join the council, which I did, and that's how I ended up there.
Wow.
And then, as you know, he became chairman of the Cato Institute after he left the council. But that's the background there. These things, oftentimes people don't realize these personal connections and personalities. So I'd worked with Bill for many, many years before he actually arrived at Reagan's council, and I joined the council and did what you did at the council. Fought for free trade,
right?
Sensible economic policies, tax cuts.
Now, at the time, did you think, and now I'm going to try to relate Austrian and supply side. At the time, did you think this supply side stuff is really different or new or goofy or voodoo? Or you remember the debate at the time?
I remember the debate at the time. I didn't think it was new in the sense that economics is all about incentives.
Right.
And supply side economics is nothing more than just incentives.
Yeah.
I mean, go back to my dissertation. I was incentives. You have a positive price of water and you have a price elasticity.
Right.
Well, supply side economics is
Right.
all about incentives. So
right.
It wasn't new to me at all. Now, the way it was framed and so forth was new, but I became fairly close to somebody over in the Treasury who was a cutting edge person in supply side economics, which was Manly Johnson.
Oh yeah. All right.
Manly eventually became the vice governor of the Fed, you know. But Manly and I were close. He was over at Treasury.
Right.
At that time, Paul Craig Roberts was over at Treasury too.
Yeah.
Norman Toure was very involved in these things. So almost all of the supply side people were very involved. David Ranson wasn't there in person, but he was involved.
Right. I think George Schultz hired him, or Art. He worked with Art at OMB. He was the economist for Art. Yeah, I remember Norman Toure. David introduced me to him as well. He used to say supply side economics is price theory applied to public finance. He said the Laffer curve is price theory. You know, the tax is a price you pay for, and you know, if you raise the price on certain activity, you'll do less of it. And I soon became a supply sider, and I was curious. Often the Austrians will fight with the supply siders about things, as you know. And
no, I just tend to. I like to just use things that work. I just think all these the big, shall we say, critique I have about Austrians, and as you say, I'm definitely at least a camp, if not a real Austrian, I'm certainly a camp follower. Leland Yeager used to use that line. Leland said, well, I might not be a pure Austrian and agree with everything they're doing, but I'm certainly a camp follower.
Yeah.
But the point is that the Austrians tend to be very chapel-like.
Yeah.
They like to go to the chapel and
Agreed.
And they like to, you know, hear the dogma repeated, and they repeat it, and the catechism and all of this stuff. It's just not for me. I'm just not wired that way. I don't enjoy going to chapel.
Again, it gets back to that issue of applied versus abstract and detached. I found even in supply side, to the extent it was empirically grounded, the debates and the studies are a lot more interesting than if it's just, as you say, if it's just faith and that kind of thing. I'm curious also why. You have any thoughts on, we all know that Keynesian economics was discredited in the 70s, and by the 80s and 90s, that supply side Austrian, however you want to call it, was not only in Reaganomics, it was being echoed even in the Clinton years. You know, even those guys didn't overturn much of the supply side policies at all. But then in this decade, or the last, since at least 2008, seems to be a revival of Keynesian economics and deficit spending and all this stuff, including zero interest rates and all the stuff that's in the general. Are you surprised? Am I misinterpreting that, first of all? And if I'm not, are you surprised that it made a comeback? I mean, it's kind of shocking to me that it made a comeback. Seems like it's made a comeback. Why?
Well, I think your characterization is, I agree with that, what you just said, but I don't know that it surprised me. I didn't think too much about it, but I don't think it never really went away. I mean, I could see with my colleagues and all the really high level post Keynesian models were always there. That's what they were teaching. I mean, if you know, I spend a lot of time with what would be called monetarism, or the quantity theory of money. I mean, in terms of macroeconomics, still the theory of everything is the equation of exchange. MV equals PY.
Right.
End of story.
Right.
And my colleagues, they poo-poo this. Oh, you know, Hanke's old-fashioned. He's he's got, the equation of exchange, Fisher,
Fisher.
it
Yeah,
was used in
100 years old.
1911, and
Yeah.
Friedman was using it, but that's all kind of passe. And it is in their models. If you look at these post-Keynesian models for macroeconomic models, they don't have money is not in the model.
Right.
How in the world can you look at macroeconomics and not have money in the model?
Right. So when
that gets back to your first question, Richard. You said, is economics today detached from reality? It's not only detached, it's on another planet.
Do you think that it rears its ugly head again when politicians want to just deficit spend? So they just grab off the shelf, they just grab whatever cockamamie theory might endorse. If that's true, that means politics is driving economics, not the other way around. Is that possible?
Yes, there's no question about it. All you have to do, well, you read any of the modern monetary theory, you pick it up right away, which is that's just a variant, a Keynesian variant or sub-school. But also for day-to-day readers, you have to read like Professor Krugman's column in the New York Times, and it's just pure Keynesian. You could pick up an old edition of Samuelson from when I was taking principles of economics in 1962 or 63. We used Samuelson, and it's all there.
Right, and he hasn't changed at all. Yeah, and if the prescription doesn't work, like if the deficit spending is massive and not working, he'll say, well, it needs to be more massive. And if the interest rates are zero, he said, well, I guess they're not working. Well, I guess they need to be negative. I mean, there's like no end to the craziness of the conclusion. There's just not enough bloodletting. The patient is fading, and the monetary quack comes in and says more bloodletting. Well, in this case, more money printing or more zero interest rates. It is kind of amazing that hold it has. So if I played MMT quack for a minute here and said the following, what would you answer? If I said something like, we're right because we're printing money almost without limit, and there's no high inflation. And we're issuing public debt almost without limit. And look, interest rates are really low. So is that the plausibility that they get to throw in other people's face? They'll say, look, where's the deleterious effects of what we're doing? This is proving our point. Does that make any sense?
Well, no, you have to add one thing in. They'll say we do have higher inflation now. The current inflation rate is 5.4%, measured by the CPI, which is over double the inflation target at 2%. Yeah. But they say, no, hang on. That's just a supply chain problem.
Right.
Now, supply chain problems are real, but those are relative price changes.
Yeah, that's
relative price change.
Yeah, it's micro. It's not the equation of exchange.
And the key driver in the whole thing is, again, MV equals PY. It's a money supply, stupid.
Yeah.
And what's happened, we have, since the COVID hit in February of 2020, we've had a massive increase in the money supply, broadly measured by the Fed measure, M2. And if you take the increase that we've had, has been 5.5 trillion since the COVID started.
Yes.
John Greenwood, who I collaborate with a lot, he's the chief economist at Invesco in London, but he's also a fellow at my institute at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
So we use something, a takeoff we've adapted from my old professor, Ken Boulding, the bathtub. Ken Boulding used to love the bathtub. Well, we've adapted it to monetary economics. We had an article last Friday about this in the Wall Street Journal. Now, here, let's just give you the numbers because it's a simple game.
Yeah.
5.5 trillion increase in M2 since the COVID. Then if they taper, as they claim they will do, and they come down to a growth rate of around 6.5% from now until the end of 2024, you add another 5.1 trillion. So you're up over 10 trillion.
Right.
That goes in the bathtub.
Right.
Now the question is, what comes out of the bathtub? Well, to fuel economic growth, you have to subtract a little over 2 trillion. That's one drain. The next drain is the demand for money. As the economy grows, the demand for holding cash balances and cash balance equivalents and money market funds and so forth goes up.
Yeah.
That's another almost 1.5 trillion. And so you have roughly, just for our purposes, 7 trillion left in the bathtub.
Yeah.
That's excess money.
Yeah.
That is not going to fuel the growth in the real economy or the growth in the money demand. That goes in the overflow drain. That's the inflation drain.
Yeah.
And that doesn't start coming out right away. There's a lag between injections of money in the economy and the time it hits the inflation overflow. So if you first start the injection, and this is the non-neutrality of money, this is Austrian.
Yes.
You first start the injection.
Yeah.
Asset prices go up. Asset prices have soared. The stock market's up. Real estate's up. All these real assets have gone up. Relative prices have gone up. Then the next thing that happens, the real economy kicks in to overdrive. And then the next thing, after about 2 years, inflation starts showing up. So you painted the typical Keynesian picture, modern monetary, nothing to worry about, a few temporary supply chain problems, and it's all going away. No, we're going to have inflation at 6-7% in 2022. That's next year.
Yeah.
In 2023, it's going to still be hanging in there. And these lags look to us like they're a bit longer than even the ones measured by Friedman and the monetarists. So we already have in the bathtub enough firepower to keep persistent inflation of about triple the level of the inflation target for the next 3 years.
So you're rejecting the this transitory inflation story or fable we're getting from Powell and others. That's interesting. You know, I'm also noticing that the equation of exchange, which you mentioned, I mean, that is just an accounting identity. Nobody can reject that. It's the theory of the interaction of the variables. But you just named that, something that Friedman might not have done. You're admitting that the velocity of money can decline. And if you measure it, it's a derived number, I realize. But when V declines a lot and offsets the increase in M, I mean, that sounds like hoarding. If the MMT people were told, well, you're creating all this money, but at the same time, people are hoarding it, they don't have a story as to how the hell it helps anything. If we're just printing it and then people are hoarding it, what is the point? You're saying that they're not going to hoard it forever, I guess.
Well, yeah, no, here's what you have with the velocity. We have at it, you know, when they shut the economy down with COVID and increased the money supply rapidly, of course, the velocity collapsed, huge collapse.
Yeah,
but
it did.
The trend on velocity is, as it is in most developed countries, the trend rate of decline is very stable and constant. It declines about 1.7% per year, velocity does. So we had this huge collapse, and as in this numbers that I gave you, what Greenwood and I have assumed, and it looks like it's happening, is that you'll have an increase in velocity until about the end of 2024, when that velocity number hits where the old trend is, and then it'll get on the trend line and start going down slowly again and be quite stable. So what this means is that actually you've got the money in the bathtub, but you're with the MV part of the thing, we've got the M in there, a lot of excess, but the V will actually accelerate a little bit until about the end of 2024. Wow. So it'll give an extra little goose to things.
Yep. And you certainly aren't, it certainly sounds like you're saying the Fed is not going to reduce M. I mean, it may taper and all that, but it's not going to reverse and start.
Oh, no, there's no way absolutely no. we've got an increment from now until the end of 2025 that's almost as much as what they put in post-COVID. If they taper and Richard are growing at 6.5% M2, they're going to add 5.1 trillion.
Incredible.
And what they've been doing, by the way, people with the deficit, now with deficit spending, people have to be careful because deficit spending can lead to inflation if the deficit's monetized. And that's what they've been doing.
Yes.
The Fed has been
buying government bonds.
The buying of the government bonds.
Yeah.
But if the Fed had not been doing that and they sold it all to the public, the money supply wouldn't increase. That's what happens in Japan. Japan has a massive deficit and their debt to GDP is to the moon.
Yeah.
It's over 200%.
Yeah,
but the money supply growth is very slow in Japan.
Yeah.
They have absolutely no inflation in Japan. And it's due to the fact that the public has massive amounts of excess savings. Savings in the private sector in Japan is much, much greater than investment in the private sector. So what happens, the public sector has a savings deficiency, huge deficits.
Yeah.
But the surplus in the private sector of savings over investment is much greater than that deficiency. So overall, the overall picture is one in which you have actually excess savings and aggregate in Japan, and you've got capital outflows going out of Japan, and you've got a current account surplus. But the modern monetary people, they don't see any of this. All they say is, oh, look, you can run these huge deficits, run huge GDP to huge deficits to GDP, and it doesn't make any difference. You'll get no inflation. But that's not what's happening. That's not the reasoning and rationale in Japan. The reasoning is what I've just given you, which has resulted in very, very low rates of growth in the money supply. It's all about MV equals PY.
Yeah. And here's an economy, Steve, you remember the late 80s. Wow, Japan's going to eclipse us. They're going to buy all our real estate. They're going to buy Rockefeller Center and Sony, and their cars and all that. And what have we seen in the last not only lost decades, they call them, lost decades. They've created more debt and more money than production. I checked the industrial production index in Japan is no higher today than it was at the end of 1989. It's incredible, the stagnation. And I think of it as, does this go too far to say, this is the Krugman economy? This is Krugman telling them for years, you need another stimulus package. You need more deficit spending. You need more this and that. They've been doing this for 30 years. And he advises the same thing for us.
This is a Keynesian view versus the monetarist view.
Yeah.
And the problem is money in Japan. The money supply has been growing at extremely anemic rates, and as a result, of course, what is MV? Okay, we have money supply, V velocity, P is the price index. Right. That hasn't gone anyplace.
Right.
And the real economy is stayed in the tank too. Yeah. If you look at PY, that's nominal GDP.
Yeah. And
that has not gone any place because MV hasn't gone any place.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible that the what I call ZIRP, the zero interest rate policies, also straight out of the Keynesian textbook, Keynes said, when there's excess savings and overproduction, that whole rejection of Say's law, you got to bring interest rates down to nothing. You got to reward capital to nothing. Is this zero interest rate policy, can we no longer say that had anything to do with stimulating the economy? That has everything to do with making public borrowing affordable. But if that's true, don't the low interest rates just induce more and more borrowing? So you get in this vicious circle of Japan's borrowing a lot because it's cheap. So why raise taxes?
Well, yeah, you get into several things. This does get into pretty good Austrian economics because you get a tremendous distortions in the capital market if you artificially keep interest rates at let's say zero at an artificial rate.
Yeah.
So you get those distortions in the capital market, but the other thing you do, you inject huge risk in the system because everyone wants to leverage up because the interest rates are very low. So you're looking around, where can I pick up a few basis points here and there?
Yeah.
That's all you can do. And then the only way you can actually make any money is to borrow and leverage.
Right.
And of course, this has also huge risk implications.
So
the zero interest rates there are two problems: a huge distortion in the allocation of capital, and the time frame with which capital investments are being made, and the length of life of capital investments, way too capital intensive. The second thing is leverage and risk. Too much leverage, too much risk.
So the argument that the only reason a cascade of public debt isn't leading to higher interest rates is sometimes you'll hear it said, well, there must be a really very intensive demand to hold these safe assets. My first thought is, wow, I'm not sure I want an economy where people only want to hold safe assets. It doesn't sound like an entrepreneurial, dynamic, risk-taking economy. It sounds like a stagnant Japan type economy. I'm just wondering if you think the US risks that. Is it true that people are eagerly holding government bonds? Because that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound good.
Well, no, that isn't entrepreneurship with a capital E, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But the other thing, you have to go back again to Irving Fisher, and interest rates follow inflation. At least let's say any interest rate over 2 years.
Yeah.
If you get out, you mentioned the yield curve, Richard. Okay, yeah. Let's look at the yield curve.
Yeah.
Anything out over 2 years, the market is going to determine what those rates are. Probably, I mean, you could conceivably get into some screwball central bank operation twist policy or something like that. But in general, what Fisher showed was that interest rates follow inflation, not the other way around.
Right.
So if we get more inflation, as Greenwood and I absolutely are certain we will get, we will have higher interest rates that follow. And when we do that, by the way, that will shake up the equity markets tremendously, and these multiples that we're trading on now will come off tremendously, and we could have a very it'll be like going down Niagara Falls in a barrel. Above the falls it's pretty calm, and below the falls it's pretty calm, but the transition's a bitch.
Well put. What do you think of crypto? I hear the libertarians will say cryptocurrencies they're an alternative to these reckless central banks, and it'll make them behave, and it'll be an alternative. Or even as an investment, Steve, what do you think of crypto? Just generally.
Well, I would have to put myself in the crypto skeptic category. This is a very complicated subject to go through the whole thing, but let's again get applied and look at something like El Salvador. El Salvador passed in July a Bitcoin law, and that Bitcoin law had various components. It was obviously written by people who'd never done any currency reforms before.
Surprise.
It could have been written in a libertarian chapel someplace for all I know. But at any rate, one of the provisions is not very libertarian. They made Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador, which was kind of bizarre to me because in 2001, I was part of helping dollarize El Salvador. We got rid of the lousy currency that they had, and replaced it with the US dollar. That was 2001. Since then, their average inflation rate has been 2.03%. It's the lowest in Latin America. It's almost identical with the United States. Their growth has been satisfactory, exports satisfactory, stability satisfactory. Everything's fine. The system, the dollarized system, works perfectly. So you get the President Bukele comes in. He's got a packed legislative body. They pass this Bitcoin law, make it legal tender. But buried in the law, Article 8 of the law is a not a legal tender provision. It is a mandatory tender provision. It's a forced tender provision, a forced tender. If anyone offers you Bitcoin in El Salvador, you have to take it, whether you want it or not. Now that you only find that kind of thing in the USSR, the old Soviet system, or in war occupation, that kind of thing. So that's part of the thing, and the libertarians are cheering this. And this shows you one of my problems with a lot of this, and that is whatever goes around in the chapel is not very carefully looked at.
Good, interesting point.
So the libertarians have been on this as if it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's been a complete disaster by someone who has become really a totalitarian. He even said, Bukele, on his new Twitter account, that he's the most popular dictator in the world.
Isn't that cute?
And the libertarians have grabbed onto this thing.
Oh my gosh.
So that's my big problem with cryptos, quite frankly, is that most of what is in the blogosphere is just not factually correct. Most of it is just nonsense or spewing.
I think also, I wonder, knowing the monetary history, I think to myself, listen, if central banks really wanted to exterminate competition, if that's what Bitcoin and others is, which I'm not sure it is, they've criminalized gold ownership before. They've banned other alternatives before. So it seems a little weird to me that if Bitcoin is going to challenge central banks, well, central banks know how to squash things like that if necessary. So Bitcoin either becomes relevant and has to be squashed, or it doesn't become relevant. We only have a few more minutes, so I thought
on the you just made, my view on Bitcoin, not cryptos in general. I think it has a very faulty design, and I think there will be a superior challenger in the cryptosphere that will take them out. I think the fundamental value of Bitcoin is zero.
Wow.
And I think it will go to zero.
Wow. That's
and why? Because of crypto competition.
Right. That's quite a statement. Okay, we have you on record. That is quite a statement. Yeah, and I think I could see why that might happen. All right, I'm gonna ask you, as we bring this to a close. This has been my gosh, I could talk to you for days. You wrote something once saying, democracy is not necessarily liberty. This is probably a decade or so ago, and I think it was called Democracy versus Liberty. We seem to be losing liberty in America. I'm just curious whether you think it's because there's too much democracy. There's not enough constitutional limits on government or something like that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we hear about democratic socialism. People really do bow down to democracy. But is your view that is not necessarily going to preserve the American system, or what's your view?
And this gets basically, I'm a classical liberal. You asked me about Austrian, but I mean fundamentally, I'm really a classical liberal. I'm much more totally comfortable with that attribution.
Yeah.
So the reason I wrote that article is that it was really kind of an attack on George W. Bush at the time,
Yeah.
as I recall.
Yeah.
And you know, the U.S. ever since Woodrow Wilson has been trying to peddle democracy all over the world. But if you look at the founding fathers, any document, it doesn't contain the word democracy. And the founding fathers were openly very worried about democracy and popular democracy. They were focused on liberty.
Yeah.
And I'm focused on liberty too. So I've been, you know, that's why did we invade Iraq?
Good question.
To spread democracy. Right. We were going to spread democracy. Well, you can see how that worked out.
What is so voting with ink on your finger? That's not going to do it for. That's not enough, huh?
That doesn't do a job on me. I am as limited as democracy can possibly be. That's where I'm at. I'm liberty maximization.
Yeah.
And I still think Milton Friedman had it about right. He said, and actually Niskanen wrote a book about this, the optimal size of government. I can't remember exactly, but Niskanen worked out the numbers.
Yeah.
And they comported to what Milton said. Milton said he'd be very comfortable if the size of government was about 10 to 15% of GDP. And that's about where Niskanen's calculations came.
Oh, interesting. And you know, the supply side, or Richard Rahn had the same kind of curve. It was called the Rahn curve, RAHN, and he had something that's similar. It was like if it's zero, of course, there's anarchy and no rule of law. So there has to be something. But if it goes beyond something like, he had the same thing, 15 or 20%. Now you're just burdening the economy. Now you're just messing things up. So here's the
Niskanen book. I just got Bill's book off of my. I'm going to hold this up. This is if you really want to get into the weeds on this, see this book.
Oh yeah, okay. Autocratic, democratic, and optimal government by who?
William A. Niskanen.
Oh yeah, look at that. Okay, good. I was
William A. Niskanen. So Niskanen, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's about 15% of GDP.
Yeah,
is optimal. Is the optimal.
Yeah. And we're approaching, I don't know, 50% if you add in state and local. I think it's getting up to 45 or 50% or so. Okay, I think we have 1 minute. What am I going to do with Steve Hanke for 1 minute? This audience, you know, is big on Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead. Just curious whether you've read any of it, or what, if you have, what you think of it.
Like every schoolboy, I read Atlas, and Ayn Rand is just not my cup of tea.
Okay, because
I don't know. Sometimes it just didn't grab with me at all. I mean, it's basically it's chapel kind of stuff, and I don't much like preachers. Let's put it that way.
Well, you know, when you say chapel, temple, I mean, I am a secular guy too. I like science. That's one of the reasons I like economics. I even like, I think political science can be scientific if it's supposed to be. That part of it I like. I mean, if you're rational and care about the numbers and care about the facts and either live your life or conduct your career that way, I'm all for that. So
see, I like when I really like to read, and Hayek of course is my favorite economist. So reading in this classical liberal kind of realm, I'm very comfortable with Hayek. I'm not comfortable with Rand.
Yeah, good. Okay.
And I'm basically not comfortable with Randists because it's very chapelish. It's like the crypto crowd. The crypto crowd is a total chapel thing.
Yeah.
They're all true believers. They all have the dogma. They know the gospel, and you know, on and on and on and on.
There's various, there's a handful of groups that try to study or promote Rand. And this one you're talking to particularly is much more the view that it should not be temple-ish. This should not be dogmatic. It should not be bowing down. It should be rational and contextual. But I love the candid answer. I'm glad we heard
Well,
from you.
let's put it this way: just knowing the crowd, I'm not wasting my time arguing against Ayn Rand. I don't have anything against Ayn Rand.
Right.
I just, I love Balzac, for example. He's one of my favorite authors, but there are other authors that I don't like particularly.
Right.
that are good French novelists.
Yeah.
And Ayn Rand is just in that category. It never clicked with me. What can I say?
Yeah. Good. I can't thank you enough. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It's been good to talk with you again. It's been a while, but it's great for me also to see you're just as active as I remember. You're just as sharp as ever. You're just as witty as ever. And I'm so glad you joined us. It was really fabulous. Maybe we.
Well, Richard, wonderful to be with you, and I hope we can continue and do it again.
Okay, so to the audience, I'm going to sign off, and once again thank Steve Hanke so much, and follow him on all the stuff he's doing. You can start at Hopkins, but you can start at the Cato site. It's easy to find on the internet.
Remember my Twitter at Steve _Hanke Hanke. I now, by the way, I'm the 6th most influential in the economists in the world on Twitter, right below Joe Stiglitz. I'm number 6. Joe is 5.
I saw that and I was astounded, and then I realized who you are, and I thought, well, that's perfectly natural. But yes, following on Twitter is
by the way,
incredible. Yeah,
Krugman is number 1.
Yeah,
he's so far out in front of us that he's in a league of his own.
Okay, but you're just chasing Stiglitz. Is that it? You're
right now. I want to knock Joe off us.
Okay, okay. We'll try to do the best we can here and push you up on stage. You got to overtake Stiglitz.
I think with your crowd, I actually am very close to him. I could overtake him.
Yeah,
and I would come back on. I might even have a more favorable word to say about Ayn Rand.
When you surpass him, you need to come back because you owe us something, I think. All right. So for those of you listening and watching, if you enjoyed the video, consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the society. Next week, we're going to have Gad Sad on, if you know him, as our next guest. Once again, signing off. Professor Hanke, thank you so much. It was delightful. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Richard.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.